Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our special council meeting for April the 25th at 7 p.m. The recommendation is that the special council meeting on April 25th, 2024 be called to order at 7 p.m. to conduct training for council and committees of council with the Integrity Commissioner of the Township of Wilmot, Ben Drury of ADR Chambers Incorporated. May I please have a mover? Moved by Councillor Martin, seconded by Councillor Cressman. All those in favor? And that carries. I do see you, Councillor Dunstall, by the way, on the screen. I will turn it over to Councillor Cressman for our land acknowledgement.
We have gathered in Wilmot Township on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee and Mississauga peoples. We also want to acknowledge the importance of the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, a peace agreement made between Indigenous nations before the Europeans arrived. It characterizes our collective responsibility to each other and Mother Earth. We should take only what we need, leave enough for others, and keep the dish clean. By acknowledging this covenant and the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, we are reminded of our important connection to this land where we live, learn, and work together as a community.
Thank you. The recommendation is that we adopt the agenda as presented for April 25th. May I have a mover? Moved by Councillor Martin, seconded by Councillor Dunstall. All those in favor? That carries unanimously. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest, councillors? Seeing none, we will jump right into our presentation, which is the Code of Conduct and Municipal Conflict of Interest Act training. And I will invite our new Integrity Commissioner, Ben Drury of ADR Chambers Incorporated, to make their presentation. I believe they're joining us online.
Hey, good evening, everyone.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us, Ben.
Oh, you're welcome. Pleased to be here. So thanks for having me tonight. So I have a set of slides I have here. I'll just share my screen. Okay, can everybody see my PowerPoint on the screen, the first page?
Yes, if it's possible that you could put it into the larger format, though. I just know my eyes, I'm having difficulty seeing it.
Let me see.
Yes, the presentation format, I believe.
Presentation mode up top, or you can use the one.
Does that assist at all?
If you go to presentation mode.
Yeah, if you could do presentation mode. Yeah, then we won't see the slides on the side.
Yeah. When I was speaking with the clerk earlier, I think there was another option that if they could put the slides up, and we just I'll just say next every time.
Yep, absolutely. It'll just,
mode.
yeah, it'll just take a moment for our clerks to be able to do that.
Sure. Okay, is that an easier format for everybody?
Just one moment. We're just having issues with both of us being able to see it on your end and our end. Are you able to see it now? Because we can see it on our end.
I can see it, yeah.
All right, then we're good to go.
Okay, great. So thank you for having me here tonight. So as you mentioned, I am the Integrity Commissioner for the Township of Wilmot. You can go next slide. I understand the attendees tonight are members of council, also members of a number of the local committees and local boards of the township. So this is basically intended to be like members of council, members of local boards. Those are the individuals who a lot of the legislation we're discussing tonight applies to. So we go to the next slide. And generally what this session will be about is speaking about our office's role under the Municipal Act 2001, the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, and the Township's Code of Conduct. Our office is a statutory role, and that also in turn relates to all of your roles. If we can go next slide. So just a bit about our company. I'm one of several commissioners, integrity commissioners at our company. So ADR Chambers, the company, provides dispute resolution services throughout Canada, including investigation and ombuds service. We're by far the largest firm in the Canadian alternative dispute resolution sector. And we've been operating in Office of the Integrity Commissioner for about 13 years now. We'll provide integrity commissioner services to over 40 municipalities and school boards, including the Township of Wilmot, also the cities of Kitchener and Waterloo. Part of the value in our services is it's not just me. We have several integrity commissioners on our roster, as well as investigators, a dedicated support and administrative staff who really gives us the ability to be available for pretty much whatever is requested. And we can, if there's ever a difficulty in me being available, for example, there are other people that I can reach out to who can step into the breach and help with any given case. Although to date, within the township, I've been able to address everything personally to date. We can go to the next slide. And about me, so I'm a senior investigator for the company. I also am a mediator and arbitrator by trade. I'm also the integrity commissioner for the city of Sarnia and the town of Wasaga Beach. I was formerly the lead investigator for the city of Toronto's integrity commissioner office, which was a full-time role. And I also, as part of my work, conduct banking investigations, municipal ombuds investigations, workplace investigations. Was also a former tribunal member of conducting bylaw hearings for the Condominium Authority Tribunal, Toronto's Administrative Appellate Tribunal. I still today conduct bylaw hearings for a number of municipalities under the AMPS program, which is largely on bylaw and parking matters, including for the cities of Kitchener and Waterloo. Go to the next slide. So, as I mentioned, the Integrity Commissioner, it's a statutory role and it's established under the Municipal Act specifically. So, under Section 223, all municipalities are required to establish codes of conduct for councils and local boards, and to either appoint an Integrity Commissioner or arrange a share-on with another municipality. The Integrity Commissioner looks over the application of the code of conduct. So, there's three primary functions to my role. One is to provide advice to council members, also members of local boards, when we receive written requests for advice about what they should do relating to an ethical issue that's arisen under either the MCIA or the Code of Conduct. We will reply within a few days with advice in terms of how the Act or the Code of Conduct applies and how you may want to conduct your affairs. Provide educational services. Part of that is what we're doing here tonight in terms of this outline of the Code of Conduct and the MCIA. And also, the biggest part of our role in general is to review and report on complaints or requests for inquiry. We occasionally get requests for investigation from members of the public, from other stakeholders, sometimes from members of council themselves, in terms of conduct by other members of council, by members of local board, in terms of allegations that the Code of Conduct or the MCA has not been respected. And our role is to investigate those matters. There is an investigation process for that. I'll be discussing that at the end of the session. That is, in general, in most cases, the largest part of the work we do. It depends to a large extent on the number of requests for investigation we receive. My own personal opinion is, in general, when we receive a lot of investigation requests in a municipality, that's usually a bit of a sign of an unhealthy council, so to speak. And when there's not a lot of complaints, it tends to reflect a bit of a healthier environment. It's not absolute, but I have tended to see a correlation over time. Next slide. So this presentation is not a replacement for the actual laws or policies themselves. The policies themselves are what matter, and the laws that are related in any given case, those are always what we refer to. This is only intended to be an overview, but it is an overview of some of the key points you'll want to keep in mind. You're encouraged to review and familiarize yourself with the applicable laws and policies. And as mentioned, part of my role is an advice-giving role. So if you have questions about the policies or your duties, especially as it relates to any particular situation you might be encountering, please reach out in writing to our office, and I'm obligated in turn to respond in writing to those requests. Next slide. So we'll begin by discussing the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, which is one of the legal matters that applies to you. The Municipal Conflict of Interest Act is really old law. It's by far the oldest law that we deal with, and it deals specifically with pecuniary interest and your duties when such interest exists. So you saw at the start of this meeting that all members were asked if you had any pecuniary interest, and if so, to declare it. That requirement arises from under this act, the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. It's technically distinct from the Code of Conduct, but the principles of the MCIA have been explicitly carried over to be part of the Code of Conduct as well. So under the Code of Conduct, it specifically says it's your responsibility as members to be ensured that you're trained in the application of the MCIA. That's part of what tonight is about. And the onus is upon you to identify a conflict of interest and take the appropriate action to disclose or identify the existence of one. If I believe this act was contravened, it is something I am allowed under the act to apply to a judge for determination respecting what the consequences of a breach of this act would be, and that will be something I'll be addressing in a few slides. Next slide. So the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act applies to members. That's a defined term, and what that means is members of council or members of a local board. You should pretty much assume that if you're here tonight, you're either a member of council or a member of a local board. Local board has the meaning that you'll see on the screen. There is a very long definition of what a local board means. I'm not going to attempt saying all that, but most importantly, it includes a committee of adjustment. It also includes in the bold there any other board, commission, committee, body, or local authority established or exercising any power in respect of municipal affairs or purposes. In general, it's reasonable for you to assume that if you're here tonight, unless you're staff of the town, you are either a member of council or a member of local board as it's understood. Next slide. And for greater clarity, the Code of Conduct for the township specifically also outlines Wilmot's committees that it believes apply. Many of them, the individuals I mentioned, are here tonight. I would also consider it's very likely that the Canada Day Task Force also would constitute a local board. Next slide, please. So in terms of types of pecuniary interest, there's three main types of pecuniary interest defined in the Act: direct, indirect, and deemed. The way I would describe that sort of in layman's terms generally is either if you yourself have a pecuniary interest, if your company has a pecuniary interest is the indirect, or if your immediate family has a pecuniary interest, it's the deemed pecuniary interest. All three of those apply. If any of those apply, you have a pecuniary interest for this situation. So basically, if you yourself, your company, or your immediate family are the typical ways of looking at this. Next slide. There is a series of exceptions where you don't need to declare a pecuniary interest. They're all outlined in the exceptions under the MCIA under Section 4. The two most significant ones to be aware of are exceptions J and K, which are interests in commons with electors generally and remote or insignificant interests. So start with K first. So remote or insignificant just means that, yeah, you have a pecuniary interest, but it's so small or insignificant, like you might gain like $1 or $2 from the situation, or it's just so unlikely that the situation where you would gain some money from it would happen that it's just not reasonably likely to be something that would influence your decision making as a member of council or a local board. That's a matter for the Integrity Commissioner to decide if it's remote or insignificant, but it is a reasonable person test. What would a reasonable person think? And if a reasonable person would think it's just so insignificant or unlikely, then it's not something you need to declare. The other one is interest in common. So interest in common, I guess like an example I could give on that is if the township were to post a tax or a levy on everybody in the township in order to build a local road, then you yourself as a resident of the township are impacted by that because you will have to pay that tax. However, because it applies to everybody, you're not impacted in any way that's different from anybody else. This exception allows you to not declare that as a pecuniary interest, because if everybody's impacted, then there's nothing really particularly impacting you personally about it. That's not your motivation. You're allowed to make decisions about something like that because it's not something that specifically affects your personal interest, and that, or at least it wouldn't reasonably be considered your driving motivation for doing so. Next slide. So the next slide defines what your duties are to do when you have a pecuniary interest. So that I'm speaking specifically to council members here, but this could also be when it relates to a matter before a local board, especially an adjudicative committee. So for using members of council as the example, as the decision makers, if a matter comes before council that you have a pecuniary interest in, where you'll be personally potentially impacted financially by what's being discussed, your obligation is before that item is considered, disclose the interest and the general nature of your interest. Don't take any part in a discussion or the vote about it. Basically, just stay completely uninvolved and don't attempt to influence the voting on any such questions. So basically, your obligations are to disclose that you have the interest and refrain from any participation or attempting to influence what happens in that discussion. You're basically supposed to be completely out of it. And if you're a part of an adjudicative board and you had a pecuniary interest in something that arises before your tribunal or your board, again, you want to declare that interest and recuse yourself from that situation, not be part of the decision making. Next slide, please. So when you have one of these pecuniary interests, so you have to file a written disclosure statement at the meeting or as soon as possible afterwards. The disclosure is noted in the minutes, and the township clerk will keep that disclosure in a registry for doing so. If your pecuniary interest is related to something happening in a closed meeting in camera, then you're obligated to leave the meeting or the relevant portion thereof. Next slide. So judges' powers upon an MCIA application. This is really reflecting the severity of the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. As I mentioned, this is really old law. It's also very, very strict and a bit draconian in its application, but you need to be aware of this. So if somebody can demonstrate either through me or to the judge directly that a member of council, a member of the local board has breached this rule, that they had a pecuniary interest in a matter, they didn't disclose it, they participated in the vote, then the consequences can be quite severe. The judge can suspend your pay as a member of council for a period of up to 90 days. They can outright declare your seat vacant, remove you from office for doing so. This is the most severe penalty that we deal with in what we do. You can also be disqualified from being being reelected for up to 7 years from the date of the order. So, long story short here, this is an act that I suggest not breaching the Code of Conduct either, but I would absolutely suggest never breach the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act because the consequences for doing so are so potentially severe. It's something you should absolutely make every effort never to be, not only not to breach, but also never even to be seen as breaching or interpreted as breaching. It's a very significant act in terms of what the consequences could be to you. Next slide, please. So in addition to the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, we also, the Integrity Commissioner is responsible for the application of the Code of Conduct. That is in all townships, as I mentioned, under Municipal Act, have to have a Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct is less severe than the MCIA because almost anything will be less severe than the MCIA, but it's still like a very significant bylaw that you need to be aware of. So if we go to the next slide. So there is an Ontario regulation that prescribes there are 4 subjects that have to be part of the code of conduct. There's almost always all municipal codes of conduct will have more than that, but these are just the 4 that absolutely must be in there. So gifts, benefit of hospitality, respectful conduct, confidential information, and use of the municipality's property. But it is conventional for all municipal code of conducts almost always to go further above and beyond this, especially over the last, I'd say, 10 years. Next slide. So your township's code of conduct starts with a statement of principle. It sets general expectations for ethical conduct. It serves as a guide for members on your overarching obligations. The statement of principle is interpretive. It's there to help me as the integrity commissioner and members to understand what this code of conduct is about. You can't breach the statement of principle in itself. We do sometimes get requests for investigation saying that a member breached the statement of principle, and we say that's not something we can investigate by itself. There has to be a contravention of an actual provision in the code of conduct for us to investigate. However, the statement of principle is important in terms of understanding sort of the guiding motivation about what the code of conduct is about. So next slide. So your statement of principle says all of the following. The code of conduct helps to ensure that members share a common basis for acceptable conduct. The standards should serve to enhance public confidence that the Township of Wilmot's elected or appointed representatives operate from a base of integrity, justice, and courtesy. The general philosophy, and this applies to all codes of conduct across the province, is that elected and appointed officials should be seen to be operating sort of at a higher standard of ethics than the ordinary person. There is somewhat of a heightened expectation upon you because you are in a position, not just of privilege, but also responsibility. So there is an expectation that you conduct yourselves in a way that reflect well on yourself and on the municipality. Next slide. So going chronologically, I'm not going to focus on each and every one of these in great depth. I'll try to highlight some of the ones that I come across more frequently where they come across, but chronologically in the code of conduct. So as mentioned, there is a provision, one of the required ones that I mentioned, that in terms of when acceptance of gifts and benefits are prohibited. So members shall not solicit or accept a reward, gift, or advantage of any kind or through family related to the duties of your office unless permitted by certain exceptions. So, and some of the exceptions include gifts not connected with the performance of your duties, legal, political contributions, the services of volunteers, token gifts you might receive for representing the township at an event, reimbursement of reasonable expenses. In general, the idea behind this rule, and as I mentioned, this is one of the mandated ones. You're not intended to benefit financially from other than the salary or remuneration you specifically receive for the role. You're not supposed to receive anything else by virtue of doing that. There are a lot of ways that through your role, like you can influence things that happen, and sometimes people will try to give you gifts to try to influence what you do. This rule is a prohibition on receiving gifts unless under like very certain exceptional circumstances that you would be allowed to do so. Next slide. Something we see a fair bit is allegations of conflicts of interest. So, and this is different from the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. So a conflict of interest more generally exists when you are or could be influenced or appear to be influenced by a personal interest, which can be a financial interest, but it could also be otherwise a personal interest of some other kind when carrying out your public duty. For example, desire to see something happen for a friend or a relative. Something that could potentially benefit somebody that you want to see benefited, not necessarily money on your part. It could also include bias in considering a matter, prejudgment, closed-mindedness, undue influence in considering a matter. This is based on a reasonable person test in terms of analyzing whether a reasonable person would think that there's a conflict exists in terms of your ability to unbiasedly consider the matter that is before you as a member of council or as perhaps a member of an adjudicator board. The wordings on the screen there are taken very closely from the major case law on point. These are the terminologies that judges and other integrity commissioners use in deciding whether there's a conflict of interest or not in a situation. Next slide. Confidentiality. So this is one of the mandated ones by Ontario regulations. So members shall not release information that contravenes the provisions of Municipal Freedom of Information Protection and Privacy Act. So there's a long list of examples you'll see in the Code of Conduct, things that you're not allowed to disclose. I'm just providing some examples here. So security over actual municipal property, personal matters about an identifiable individual, any proposed or pending acquisition by the municipality, any matter in respect to which council can hold a closed meeting, trade secrets. There are many others in the Code of Conduct. You'll see like a very lengthy list. Those are just some highlights, but there are quite understandably like a number of things that are just considered confidential information to the town. Long story short, you can't reveal those. You can't disclose confidential information that you are by duty required not to disclose. If you have a question about releasing information, it would be more appropriate as a first step to refer to the appropriate staff involved in terms of their perspective on what is and what isn't confidential information. Next slide. We do sometimes get complaints about communication and media relations. There is a requirement in most municipal codes of conduct. It is actually incumbent upon you as a member to accurately and adequately communicate the attitudes and decisions of council, even if you don't agree with a majority decision, so that there's respect for the decision-making process. The decisions are conveyed openly and accurately. I'm currently in the midst of doing an investigation right now in our municipality where this is one of the key points. A member of council, they were on the losing end of a decision. I believe it was either 8-1 or 7-2. I think it was 8-1. And they actively went on social media saying, I disagree with this decision. Don't lump me in with the rest of council here. I don't agree with any of this. And that is very likely a breach of the Code of Conduct. Even if you disagree with your fellow councilors, you are obligated once a decision is made to respect the decision that was made. Your disagreement is going to have been noted on the record during the decision-making process. Once that decision is made, though, it is incumbent upon you to respect the decision that is made and to adequately and accurately at least communicate what the decision was. You are allowed to voice some disagreement with it, but you can't basically improperly characterize what it was that happened. That itself is a breach of the Code of Conduct. Next slide. So use of municipal property and other resources. So as mentioned, you can't use municipal property, equipment, supplies for purposes other than municipal duties. All municipal property remains the property of the township, and any information you gain in the execution of your duties that the public doesn't have, you can't use for your own personal benefit. Confidential information that you receive in the fulfillment of your duties. Next slide. The next one is an important one. We get a lot of complaints about these, and I normally say that we can't investigate them. I've received, certainly, even just in my time as Integrity Commissioner for the Township of Wilmot, received some complaints requesting investigations about this, and I've to date declined to investigate them for the reasons I usually indicate to those complainants. So conduct at council and committee meetings. You are obligated under the procedural bylaw to conduct yourself with decorum at meetings, show respect for delegations and fellow members and staff. I have, if we can go to the next slide. Our office has routinely, myself as part of that, but other integrity commissioners within our office as well, have also said this. We typically refuse unless we actually receive a motion from council as a whole requesting an investigation. We have refused to investigate matters that actually happen at council itself. The reason for it is based on case law. We've frequently cited this case. I'm not gonna try to say all that out loud. If you're able to see, if you can take 30 seconds just to read what's on the page, but it goes over some of the reason why we won't investigate such matters. I'll just give you 30 seconds.
I'm going to be honest, Ben, I'm not able to read that font, and I know a lot of our committee members sitting
That's fine.
in the audience can't read it. If you want to give maybe an abridged version, if you feel you need to elaborate more, but Councillor Martin.
Sure. Okay, so I'll do that. So
Sorry, I just have Councillor Martin asking a question.
Through you, Mayor Sallin, I was just wondering, why don't we invite people to sit closer? Could people just sit in any of these chairs?
Yeah, I'm happy if people want to move closer. You're welcome to sit in these seats and get a closer view if you'd like as well. Thank you for the
I
suggestion.
would understand if the
Councillor
font
Martin.
is pretty small because there's a lot of text on there. The abridged version, I guess, if I can try to summarize it would be making a very long story short. Basically, the procedural bylaw is the mechanism for enforcing decorum at council and creating orderly conduct during meetings. It's incumbent upon the chair of the meeting to enforce decorum and conduct during the meetings as it's happening. And to have the integrity commissioner come in after the fact and say decorum was breached or this was improper would basically be usurping the appropriate role of the chair in a way that is inconsistent with the way that the municipal act and the procedural bylaw work together. So the only appropriate, so if there's a decorum issue happening in the moment, it's appropriate if it's raised, it's appropriate for the chair to deal with it in the moment. If council as a whole makes a motion later and asks me to investigate, I would be willing to do that. I usually have been. There's not a lot of reason usually to decline that. When it happens, it does occasionally happen. I'm doing one of those right now for City of Sarnia, for example. But in general, it better it respects the self-governing nature of a council. The council will be the judge of its own conduct within itself, and its council's responsibility to self-govern itself and its operation. It's not incumbent upon the integrity commissioner to step in and sort of try to be the police of council. That's not what this rule is about. I do have the right and the obligation to oversee the code of conduct in this application. In this case, it's more the procedural bylaw that applies more so than the code of conduct, and council should self-govern itself in meetings as the meeting is happening. Next slide. This is the continuation of the same case. It's evidence that in the city of Toronto, for sure, a series of 3 different integrity commissioners have all declined to ever investigate procedural bylaw issues unless specifically asked to do so. It's just not, there's a general belief it's not something that's valuable or philosophically appropriate in relation to the self-governance of council. It's also something that doesn't happen at the federal or provincial level. Next slide. So some other aspects of case law that we come across, an issue that we come across a lot is political speech. We get a lot of complaints, people saying this councillor or that councillor said something that they don't like, or there's just unlikable, and they say that there's a complaint, I should do something because this councillor said so-and-so. Usually, and not always, because you'll see on the next slide, but usually we also decline jurisdiction over that kind of speech as well. The reason being, is also a philosophical question, but the democratic nature of office means that you have to have the right to basically say your mind. Like your role is to take up leadership on issues. It's a representative role, you know, on top of being a legislative role. And as a philosophical matter, accountability for exercising political judgment or having political opinions is a matter for the political process. It's a matter if people have issues with you, the appropriate way for them to take action on that is more or less to vote in the way so that you don't come back. That's philosophically, if people have issue with you, that's how they are supposed to address that. And not as much to an integrity commissioner investigation. It's not the integrity commissioner's role to be the police of what's appropriate comment, what's appropriate speech, what's appropriate political debate, subject to exceptions. There are exceptions, as I'll get to in the next slide, but as a general rule, I don't get involved as the integrity commissioner in trying to more or less be the police of what you can or cannot say. I don't believe that's the appropriate function of the role. Next slide. Now, it isn't appropriate for me to inquire whether a conduct or statement is political speech in the first place. Not everything that you ever say is considered political speech. That's a fact-specific question. It is understood that you have other jobs, other interests, but you're a member of council 24/7. You never stop being a member of council, even if you're working in another job. You are still, while you're doing that, a member of council at the same time. You don't get to pick and choose when you're considered a member of council. So there are things you can say in other contexts that people might consider offensive or inappropriate. And if I look at it and decide it's not, in fact, political speech designed to try to encourage a position or advocate for something, that's part of your actual role that you could impact. It could well be determined to be not political speech in the first place. And then once you don't fall into that exception, and the code of conduct simply applies, and you have to address, was this a violation of the code of conduct? So that is the exception to my previous statement that I don't look into political speech, is that not everything you ever say is political speech. Next slide. Influence on staff. So this is an obligation that we do see a fair bit. It speaks to the relationship between municipal councils and municipal staff. The role of council and the role of staff are different. Both bodies are very important to the functioning of the municipality. You have important but different roles. It's important for members to be respectful of the fact that staff work for the municipality as a body corporate. They're charged with making recommendations that reflect their professional expertise and corporate perspective. They have to do so without undue influence from any individual member or even group of members, under the direction of the CAO, or if there's a different title within the township, the equivalent. Their responsibility is to provide consultation, advice, and direction to council, and to implement policies the council approves. So you should expect high quality advice from staff based on political neutrality and objectivity, irrespective of politics or loyalties and personal opinions. That's something that you as council and councilors should expect from staff. They also have expectations of you in return. We can go to the next slide. So respect for town staff is an important part of the code. Our office and we've often cited a 2018 report from the city of Toronto. So in questioning staff report and action, so members of council should ensure that your comments are in the nature of fair comments. So you are entitled to robustly and fairly scrutinize the information and advice that you receive. What you shouldn't do is ever publicly state or imply that any particular public servant or group of public servants acted, for example, for political reasons or political motivations or private motivations in some way that was negligent or that failed to meet professional standards. These statements normally would not be tolerated during a council meeting, and could potentially, if I'm asked to look into it, could result in the councillor being found to have contravened the code of conduct if you make commentary of this sort of type that is basically disrespectful to town staff in a way that would not be considered fair comment. You need to be extra careful about making statements about members of the public service that are broadcast in mass media. Members of council have the opportunity to engage in the public arena in ways that staff do not. Staff don't have the same platform that you have. A different way of saying is if a member of council goes in and makes an issue about staff public in the media, it's not a fair fight. Staff can't fight back through that medium in a way that you could, and that's a big part of why doing that is just completely frowned upon and would be a violation of the code of conduct, because it's effectively it's not a fair fight at all. Staff can't engage in the public in the way that you as a member of council can. Next slide, please. This is a large text. So basically, in that Toronto case I referred to, they referenced writings from Fenn and Siegel from 2017. I'll just read some of the quote here since it may be easier in this context. So, municipal government operates in a political arena. A councillor may quite properly accuse staff of being incorrect, lacking in research or creativity, being insensitive to community concerns, being too slow. Staff might not like it, but it's the right of democratically elected representatives to say such things if they're warranted. But there's limits to that shouldn't be exceeded. A councillor should never accuse a staff member publicly of for example, stupidity, unethical behavior, incompetence. If you feel that way as a member of council, the appropriate way for you to address this is take this up privately with, for example, the CAO. Next slide, please. Harassment or bullying. This is something that's becoming a part of many codes of conduct across the province. Probably about 10 years ago, you wouldn't have seen this in most codes of conduct. Now you will see it in most of them. Sort of harassment and bullying is sort of like the same standard. I mentioned I'm also a workplace investigator. It's the same standard typically employed in workplace investigations that we conduct. So harassment or bullying is prohibited. Means harassment of another member of council, another member of a local board, staff, or a member of public. It's considered misconduct, and it's the policy of the township that all persons be treated fairly in the workplace and an environment free of discrimination and free from personal and sexual harassment. Harassment is specifically defined in the code of conduct. It's a very long definition there, but it is in the code of conduct. Bullying is also misconduct. It's considered ongoing health or career endangering mistreatment. Usually takes the form of psychological abuse. Often verbal and strategic insults are intended to prevent targets from being successful in their job or position. So if it used to be the case that even though members of township staff, under township policy there was policies for harassment for township staff, there didn't used to be the same obligation upon members of council. That same obligation that township staff are subject to is now also an obligation that members of council, members of local board are now also subject to. I think it's a good development. Prior to the time that this was part of the code of conduct, there was a general perception that members of council could get away with harassing conduct in ways that ordinary staff, ordinary people working in any job could not get away with. And it really violated the general principle I mentioned in terms of the statement of principle that you should be seen to be operating at a higher level of responsibility and ethics. Sometimes members of council were operating at a lower level of ethics and getting away with it because there was nothing in the code of conduct that prevented it. So there is now this harassment or bullying provision saying that, yes, you are subject to the same rules as anybody in any workplace would typically be subject to. Next slide. Encouragement for the municipality and its laws and policies. There is a catch-all provision in the code of conduct which says that failure to abide by any bylaw or policy of the township is itself a breach of the code of conduct. So if you breach one of the township's policies, that is necessarily a breach of the code of conduct by virtue of this catch-all provision. Basically says members one of the things it says is members shall encourage public respect for the municipality and its bylaws and policies. You, as a member of council or a local board, are required to follow the township's policies as well, because if you don't, that means you've also breached your code of conduct. Next slide, please. This next slide is only in the council code of conduct. It's not part of the local board code of conduct, but members of council, there is this rule relating to employment of council relatives, which is described in the code of conduct itself as nepotism. It says members of council shall comply with the provisions of the township's policy C-1.1, hiring family members, which outlines the circumstances under which family members may work together at the township. It's a policy that you should make yourself aware of. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that a big part of our role as the Integrity Commissioner is to investigate complaints that come to us. As I mentioned, there is a formal complaint procedure for complaints that we received. It's designed on natural justice and giving fair opportunities to participate for all sides involved. So complaints have to be in writing, filed through the clerk or the deputy clerk, and the complaint has to set out the grounds for belief that there was an alleged contravention and provide any supporting evidence. I or one of my delegates will either investigate. As mentioned, I can refuse to investigate if the allegations are, for example, frivolous or vexatious or outside my jurisdiction. As I mentioned, I have received, even just in my time with the township, some complaints that I did consider to be outside of jurisdiction. You would have never heard about them. I can tell you that some have happened. When I find that something is out of jurisdiction, you as the member will not know that it even happened. Only the complainant will be informed. There will just be in the annual report a brief mention that we received a case and it was dismissed in that fashion. During an investigation, my office and I will preserve confidentiality respecting all matters that come to our knowledge in the course of our duties. The reason for that is that confidentiality is mandated under the Municipal Act, which is the act that gives us power to do anything at all in the first place. As I mentioned, it's a statutory rule. All of our powers and duties come from the Municipal Act 2001. If a breach is found, then the Integrity Commissioner shall prepare a formal written report and recommendation for council and may recommend disciplinary action pursuant to what is allowed under the Municipal Act 2001. Next slide. So a typical way an investigation would go, there would be an exchange of written statements and documents. So we would have the submission from the complainant. The respondent would be encouraged and offer an opportunity to reply to it. Please provide me a written submission about what you think happened. The complainant will have an opportunity to reply. I will offer an interview to both sides involved to orally speak with you or by writing if you prefer about what it was that happened. I can also, because this is an investigative role, I can also seek out my own evidence independently. It's important to note, so under the Municipal Act, the township is obligated pursuant to subsection 223.43 and 4 to give me all information that under the township's control that I believe is necessary for the inquiry. I am entitled by law to have free access to all books, accounts, electronic records of the township that I believe are necessary. So, for example, email records, report records, any documentation records that belongs to the township is basically fair game to me. I am entitled by law to have access to it within the scope of an investigation. And if anybody refuses to give me information that I asked for that's relevant to an investigation I have control over, that's a breach not just of the code of conduct, but potentially also actually a breach of the Municipal Act. Next slide. When I issue a report, so if I find, for example, that there is no breach of the code of conduct, that'll be maintained confidential only to the parties. Only the parties will know about that. However, when I do find that there is a breach of the code of conduct, then I will issue my report to council. It becomes public information. Council is then obligated to consider the report and is empowered to basically do what it wants with the report. It's council that ultimately is the decision-making body with respect to what the penalties are going to be if there is a recommendation. Under the Municipal Act 2001, the penalties that could be imposed for non-compliance with the code of conduct are actually quite limited. Specifically under 223.4 sub 5, all that can be imposed as it stands right now are either a reprimand or a suspension of the remuneration paid to the member in respect of their services as a member for a period of up to 90 days. So I can't just, if I find a violation, say I find there's a breach of the code of conduct here and just willy-nilly say, I recommend anything be done. I'm limited to giving a recommendation up to that 90-day suspension of pay, and council is also limited to that 90-day suspension of pay as the maximum penalty it's allowed to impose for a violation of the code of conduct. Next slide. And that's actually the conclusion. Hopefully that is helpful. I'm absolutely happy to stay for questions about anything that was part of this presentation. I hope this was helpful to you. I'd like to open the floor if there are any questions or comments about it.
Thank you very much, Integrity Commissioner. First, I will look to our councillors if there's questions, and then after, as I know we have many committee representatives, if you have questions, I will turn to you after council has asked theirs. Councillor Dunstall? You're on mute.
You're on mute.
Thank you. That doesn't happen often. Thank you, Ben. And my reputation may precede me, so I am familiar with the process. What I wanted to ask you was, on the March 25th meeting, Integrity Commissioner Williams noted that there was an alarming trend where the Integrity Commissioner's office is increasingly being weaponized by people with different opinions against councillors. And I wanted to know if you had observed that trend.
I think so. I've been doing this work for about 10 years. It is people, it's not uncommon for people to make complaints to our office like this, that they have something that they're attempting to achieve. That doesn't mean necessarily that they're wrong. Sometimes they do have a legitimate point, and sometimes contraventions are found. It's not uncommon though for we investigate a matter, no contravention is found, and it appeared to just be really more of a political issue than a genuine concern about what took place. It's not uncommon, I guess, is one way to say it. People have a lot of different motivations for filing a complaint. In many cases, it's a genuine belief. I don't believe it's common for it only to be about politics. There's usually a genuine belief in the people involved that there was something wrong here or something should be done. As mentioned, I specifically, and I know some of my colleagues as well, have really taken it upon ourselves to really be limited in what we do about political speech, also in terms of what happens during conduct at meetings. That reduces the role that we play somewhat. I think reducing that role is a good thing. I think there are some integrity commissioners who don't apply those rules and will get involved in conduct meetings or will get involved in political speech. I think what you end up seeing when that happens is just lead to like a cascading number of complaints, a cascading number of violations, and it just really disrupts council and the stability of it. I usually try to stay out of political debate as much as possible. As mentioned, not everything people say is political speech, but it's something that's really been a hallmark of my own approach, and some of my colleagues, I've encouraged it as well. It was also an approach, as mentioned, I was the lead investigator at the City of Toronto for a couple of years. It's the approach used at the City of Toronto as well, where there's the philosophy that I use and was used at the City of Toronto is that it's not appropriate as the Integrity Commissioner generally to be getting involved in political debate. Not every Integrity Commissioner follows that philosophy. I believe it's a best practice to do so because it's not really appropriate in my view to be making political judgments for the politicians. I think the nature of politics is people are going to disagree with what you say a lot. People disagree with what we say as integrity commissioner a lot. But it is the entitlement of the politician to speak their mind, subject to certain restrictions. You can't just say anything, but I do attempt to have a less involved and invasive role than some others in this field, I guess is one way I would say that.
Thank you.
Any other, Councillor Martin?
Thank you, Mayor Salonen. Thank you for your presentation, Ben. I appreciated it. I just wanted to confirm, and maybe the question is not necessarily to you, Ben, but people here. I pulled up the code of conduct for elected officials for the Township of Wilmot, and what I have is November 19, 2007. Is that our up-to-date code of conduct?
I'll leave that for someone else to answer.
The clerk, if you wanted to.
Yes, through you, Mayor. I was nodding, and sorry, not many people could see that, so yes, that's correct. And that's the version that's online as well.
Councillor Dunstall, did your hand go back up for another question? Nope. Okay. Councillor Cressman, since you're the only other one who hasn't spoken, are you good at the moment?
I guess I was thinking during the presentation, pecuniary interest speaks to money, but we certainly had a recent issue, and Councillor Dunstall doesn't want to likely get into it, but I will get into it because I felt if members of committees or council are part of a service club that benefit from a decision that a member of council makes sitting on a committee, is that a pecuniary interest, or is that just because they're being a good citizen in the township and anyone is invited to serve and be part of that committee, and just so happens the ones that decide to get involved are the ones that she or her husband or any counselor is part of. To my mind, I'm trying to determine where the edges of the table are in a pecuniary interest. Money is easy, I think, in my mind, but when it becomes where we contribute to our community and be part of service clubs, that strikes to me as being something we do. Well, I guess I'm looking for your comments.
I will just quickly jump in before you answer that and just say, I do appreciate the candor. I'm just going to ask that the answer be more broad-based and not about any prior integrity commissioner complaints. But go ahead.
Yep, understood. I appreciate it. I'll ask the clerk actually if they could pull up a couple of slides here. The first one would be slide number 9, application of the MCIA.
We'll pull that up for you.
Okay, so there's 2 slides I want to refer to, but so the first one is when the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act applies in the first place. So as mentioned, so the MCIA applies to members, meaning members of a council or members of a local board. And I interpret your questions basically as a first step to your question. You have to analyze whether the individuals involved are actually part of a local board in the first place. The MCIA only applies if they can be considered a member of a local board. And so the key part there is sort of like the part in bold there. Are you part of any other board, commission, committee, body, or local authority established or exercising any power or authority under any general or special act in respect of any of the affairs or purposes, including school purposes, of one or more municipalities or parts thereof? That's a mouthful, and as you can imagine, that's really, it's more of a work of art than science to interpret that. However, if you can be considered to be acting as part of a board or local authority that has power or authority to do things for the municipality, then you could reasonably be considered to be a member of a local board of the municipality. That would make you subject to these rules. And then what those rules are, again, are the pecuniary interest rules that I mentioned, which is that if you have a pecuniary interest, if you stand to potentially make money as a result of decisions that are made by the committee that you're part of, you should be disclosing the interest and recusing yourself so that you're not involved in any of the decision-making relating to that. If you don't do that and you're found to have contravened the MCIA, you can be removed from the office that you're part of. You can be prevented from returning to that office for a period of 7 years. As I mentioned, that's the sort of draconian act I was speaking about in the beginning. There's also conflict of interest concerns potentially in what you described. So if we go to, I don't know the exact slide number, but it's the one marked conflicts of interest. It's around 21 or so. Okay, good. It is 21. As mentioned, in the code of conduct that members of council and members of local boards are subject to, there's also this more general conflict of interest provision, which is broader than what's in the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. So the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act talks about pecuniary interest, which is just money interest. The conflict of interest rule in the code of conduct is much broader. It's a more generalized notion of conflict of interest. It's basically when you either are or could reasonably appear to be influenced by some kind of personal interest in carrying out your public duty. So that can include money interests, but it could also include other kinds of personal interests whereby you want to see somebody else benefit, or you're trying to help a friend, help a family member, or trying to help an organization that you care about, and just are putting the interests of that person or organization or yourself ahead of the interests of the body that you're part of and ahead of the interests of the municipality. That is supposed to be your primary objective as a member of a local board, is furthering the objectives and interests of the municipality. If you're trying to further your own objectives within the municipal role that you have, that could be considered, that could be a conflict, a breach of the code of conduct, and something like that would be found. That doesn't even require a monetary interest. As I mentioned, that could be a more broader, just general conflict where you're just trying to further your own personal interest or interests of those that are near or dear to you. So that's based on the reasonable person test under law. So it's not just money interests that are caught. It's just money interests under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, but under the Code of Conduct, conflict of interest is actually a much broader notion that goes beyond just monetary interests.
Very good. Follow-up, Councillor Cressman?
Yes, through you, Mayor. I think it was more looking at interests in common and where does the interest in common and, become for everyone, or the interest of a group that has decided to volunteer for certain things. And that's where I was trying to tease it out and try to determine where that becomes, where it becomes then a conflict of interest.
Okay, yeah, and I referred to so what you're referring to, the interest in common, is on slide 12. We can just bring that up. I don't have a ton on that slide. We can bring up slide 12. Okay, so when I was speaking about slide 12, so this is relating to the exceptions under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, whereby if you have one of these two situations, you don't have to declare the interest, because it's either, in what we're speaking about here, we're speaking about the interest in common, which is J there. When I was talking earlier, so I mentioned the example of if council was voting on a tax or a levy on everyone in the township for the sake of building a road, you wouldn't have to, everybody is impacted by that, including yourself. You wouldn't have to declare it because everybody is impacted. You don't have a special personal interest, or you're not impacted in a way that's really much different from anybody else around you. It would be a question of fact. It would be something that would have to be an investigation by me or by one of my delegates into what took place post facto. Or have a person, a member, as I mentioned, I could also, members of council, members of local boards are entitled to write to me seeking advice on a matter, a written request for advice, and as I mentioned, I respond with advice in turn. Only the individual member can do that. Any individual member can't sort of request advice on behalf of somebody else. If an individual member is interested in what another member is doing, it has to be through an investigation request. I would say in general, the question is really, is it an interest in common with electors generally? It doesn't have, as the sub-bullet there says, it doesn't have to be everybody involved, but you at the very least have to have a significant definable group of the general population involved, something that's reasonably close to everybody or almost everybody. And if everybody or almost everybody isn't impacted by the interest at stake, then I don't think it would be reasonably considered to be an interest in common, and therefore, because you wouldn't fall under the exception, you would have to declare it. But it's a matter of art. It's a matter that would have to actually specifically be investigated by me or my office. It's not something I can give a general statement, blanket statement saying yes this or no that. It's something that requires either a specific request for advice or a specific investigation request.
Thank you. Councillors, any other questions at this time? Okay, seeing none. Committee members, I would open it up to yourselves if any of you have questions at all. Okay, I do not see any questions. Oh, Councillor.
That was a very specific question. I think this isn't feeling like this is more overall understanding of the context rather than asking them about specific action.
I didn't hear the question, so if somebody can.
It's okay. Sorry, at the moment it's not exactly a question. It's more so there's a table conversation happening. Just give us one moment there, Commissioner.
Through Mayor Salonen, there had been some questions at the Canada Day Committee about integrity and conflict of interest. So I just thought it seems like a good forum to bring it up would be my recommendation. That's what I would think. I
would say if it's personal advice that you're looking for, then go directly to the Integrity Commissioner. If it is more of a broad-based question and understanding, then this would be the appropriate forum. Okay.
I agree with that.
Very good. So there are no questions then. You may get some emails, however, follow-up that are direct, specific, case-by-case questions. So seeing no more questions at this time, I would say thank you very much, Commissioner, for joining us. We're happy to have you on board, and I know it was a good refresher for council and myself and for committee as well. So thank you very much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
On to the rest of the proceedings of our meeting. We do have announcements. I did want to note an event that came to my attention after my announcements on Monday, which is the New Dundee Women's Institute is hosting the Women's Walk the World event this Saturday, April the 27th at 10 a.m. at the New Dundee Community Centre is where they're all meeting, and then they will go on walks. It's a bring your own lunch, and walks can range from 15 minutes to, I know that there's some longer walks they have planned for around 5 kilometers or so. I also want to take this opportunity to thank all of our committee representatives who are here today, as well as those who are not. We don't often get an opportunity to see you guys face to face unless we pop into your meetings, and I just want to extend my gratitude on behalf of council as well as the general public for your volunteer service to our community. It's really important work that you guys do, and I just want to extend gratitude for taking on these roles and helping our municipality be a better place to work and live. So thank you. And thank you, of course, for taking time tonight to come join us for this training. With that, councillors, do any of you have announcements? No? Okay, seeing none. Confirmatory bylaw will be read a first, second, and third time and finally passed in open council. For that, may I have a mover? Moved by Councillor Cressman, seconded by Councillor Martin. All those in favor? That carries unanimously. And adjournment. May I have a mover? Moved by Councillor Cressman, seconded by Councillor Martin. All those in favor? That carries unanimously. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night.